Next we have Alex Sharp presenting Engineering and Interplanetary Economy.
Hey everyone.
Hello.
Just mic check, can everyone hear me? All okay? As in yes, no?
Yes.
Yes, we're
Yes,
good.
all good. So engineering and interplanetary economy, financial engineering the future. One of the original titles was just securitizing Mars, but securitizing Mars sort of brought in images of space marines and all the rest, so I kind of put that in as a subtitle. Introductions. So, hey everyone, I'm Alex Sharp, as you can see. So in my day job, I'm a co-founder of a wholesale cloud computing company, so we use supercomputing technology to make faster, cheaper cloud. It's called Orion VM. But when I'm not doing my day job, I'm very interested in space, and that's what brought me to here. So if anyone has any sort of questions or what have you about the content that I'm going to bring up, or if you're interested in the slides or what have you, just go and send me an email. The email's up there. So I'm going to do this in a somewhat unconventional order here. So I'm going to start with my conclusion so you can go through and put everything else in context. And then I'm going to work through the various points, and there's going to be kind of a Q&A. So as a general point here, I'm giving sort of a high-level overview of a lot of things that have some fairly intricate sort of parts. So some of it's going to get brushed over. If you'd like to go further into any part, just go through and ask a question at the end. So I've been told a bit earlier that because there's nobody after me, there's not going to be a very hard sort of time limit at the end. So feel free to go and ask questions. So I know you guys can read, but just for the, the conclusion that I am starting with is essentially that once you have viable commercial space travel, interplanetary colonies aren't a matter of, well, hey, can we solve all the engineering challenges? Can we solve all the legal challenges? Can we solve the political challenges? And it starts to become a lot more of a straightforward economic question. So in terms of at what point can we go through and say that having one of these colonies is going to go and be profitable? Because once it is profitable, then those, for example, the political challenges will start to melt away. There'll be the money invested in the engineering challenges that will go and allow them to be solved a whole lot more effectively than trying to, say, put the cart before the horse. So just 1 second. I forgot to set a timer, which is always fun. So next stage, acquiring new territory. So the major reason why this is important is because when doing business, especially on another planet, there are a lot of things that are up in the air. Especially in terms of acquiring new territory on other planets, because in general there aren't many useful legal principles to go by. So you have Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which on a plain reading would suggest that you can't, for example, claim Mars. You can't go through and say, oh hey, I'm going to stick a flag in there and say this is now part of the US. However, it's also fairly ambiguous as to like some of the finer points there. And it's also fairly changeable. So there are two major sort of thrusts of argument here. So the first is that you go within, well actually there are a couple more. So the first is you go within the current version of Article 2 with its current wording, but you just change the meaning of the words. So it's a fairly common legal tactic in that, especially when you have things that haven't been properly litigated, and so there isn't much in the way of case law, you can just go through and take a somewhat unconventional reading of the treaty that just so happens to give you what you want. And then when push comes to shove, you can go into court and all the rest and argue for that, and you may or may not get that. But in general, by the time you've gotten to that argument, you already have your Mars base. And so that comes again to the first point of de facto versus de jure, acquiring new territory, which, to kind of put that in a different way, possession is 9/10 of the law. So if the United States has, for example, a Mars base with police that they're paying for, with emergency services that they're paying for, that operate under US law, then even if there isn't maybe a 100% legal footing to show that, going through and getting that legal footing then becomes a whole lot easier. And again, at that last point, Article 15 is how you modify the Outer Space Treaty and only requires 55 UN signatures, which for any of the major superpowers, which in the race to Mars would probably be the US or China, those 55 UN signatures are definitely doable if it is understood to be in the best interests of the US to push for this on an international level. So moving forward. So an important part of this is that a Mars colony is going to be in a very different sort of relationship from, for example, Guam or any standard sort of US state. And this then brings up the first 2 points of special autonomous regions and special economic zones. So the basic idea between both of those, because they're similar sorts of concepts, are that you go through and you grab a state or a territory, and then you give it certain rights that would generally be reserved for a sovereign state. So, for example, Hong Kong is a special autonomous region, and so Hong Kong can go through and have its own currency, can have its own legal system, can have its own taxes, and all the rest. And that is all very useful if you're starting a colony on another planet where, for example, the tax regime is likely going to have to be very different. The legal regime is going to be different because the laws on Mars are likely going to have to reflect the realities of Mars, and that it is a very different place than on Earth. And specifically that special economic zone, being able to go through and levy taxes and spend it on yourself, rather than having to, for example, levy taxes and then send it back to the US, that is very important when you have an emerging economy that you're trying to develop. And just going back to one of my earlier points with Hong Kong and the Hong Kong dollar, having a Martian dollar is a very interesting idea, because once again, from a policy point of view, the value of a US dollar and how that reflects global trade is going to be a very different thing than what is useful for a colony on Mars. So being able to go through and change the price of that Martian dollar up or down compared to what would be its regular resting price would then allow you to, for example, make imports into Mars artificially cheap, or make exports out of Mars artificially cheap. And I'll bring that up later on. But I think that's a very, very important point. And that last point there is sovereign debt, and that brings up another major reason why having a government here makes a lot more sense than trying to do it as a purely commercial sort of thing, which is that you have a government. A government has a tax base. A government can go through and raise debt on the global markets at very low interest rates over very long time horizons and use that to go and invest in infrastructure. On the other hand, if you're a commercial entity, even if you're something as large as a SpaceX or what have you, SpaceX is nowhere near as creditworthy as most governments, simply because SpaceX doesn't have an army and a tax base to pay their bills. Well, at the moment, anyway. So this is speculation, but it's speculation coming from first principles. So just to point of clarity here, this isn't Martian exports back to Earth. Most of that would be silly. This is Martian exports out into the asteroid belt over to the moon or to other colonies. So that first point, iron steel products, read that as specifically 301 stainless steel for starships. Because at the end of the day, if you can send a starship full of Raptor engines to Mars and go through a manufacturer set of starships on Mars, that is a whole lot, it's just a whole lot easier and a whole lot cheaper to do. Food specifically for the moon, because even though the polar ice caps on the moon do have organics, they don't have them at the sort of quantities that you would find on Mars. And fuel and the like is, again, like, you can find large quantities of carbon on Mars. It's literally the atmosphere, and going through and converting that into fuel, converting that into plastics and things like that makes a lot more sense than trying to, for example, convert the small amount of lunar carbon into large plastic enclosures or what have you. But going back somewhat, so I said we're doing this from first principles. What are the first principles here? And the first principles for Martian exports are that you have a planet that contains most of the major minerals that you need, well, depending on what you're looking for, everything that you need, inside a reasonably weak gravity well with a very weak atmosphere. It's not dense at all. And so the delta V required to go through and get your stuff from the ground into orbit is very low. And given the exponential nature of the rocket equation, that difference multiplied again becomes a very, very large sort of comparative advantage for certain things being made on Mars and then exported. And the standard of IP remote work is, well, I guess the standard trope for what do you send out of Mars? Well, you send data because that's the easiest. However, continuing on, there is an interesting point here in terms of industrial and chemical processing, precision manufacturing, semiconductors, and all the rest. Because at the end of the day, Mars, one, has a whole bunch of raw materials, and two, it's stationary. So if you go through and you have like a whole bunch of 1,000-ton plus chemical plants and industrial plants, you're not going to put that in the asteroid belt and go and try and move that around to wherever your resources happen to be. You're going to move those resources onto a stationary sort of target, in this case on Mars, and then you're going to move the reasonably small, reasonably high value products out. And this makes additional sense because those products are either reasonably small, reasonably high value, or reasonably complex to manufacture. And so going through and building the factories to manufacture them out in the asteroid belts or whatever would be hard to do. And that second to last point in terms of people is a very important one. As I mentioned earlier on, moving stuff from the surface of Mars to other places is a whole lot cheaper than trying to do so from Earth. And so if you're trying to, for example, populate the asteroid belts, if you're trying to populate Europa or what have you, it makes a whole lot of sense for those people to come from Mars. So forwards versus futures markets. This is a bit more, at the moment, if you're going through and saying, hey, I want to move a shipping container from Earth to Mars at a particular date, you go through and you have something that is basically a forwards contract. So it's a bespoke contract, so my lawyers talk to SpaceX's lawyers for 6 months, and they eventually work out what they're doing, how they're doing it, but that's, yeah, very much bespoke and very, very expensive in terms of the transaction costs in order to actually do that. On the other hand, if rather than having these bespoke contracts for example, me to send one particular thing to Mars, you standardize that into a futures contract to move, say, a generic shipping container to Mars. Now that's a standardized contract, the transaction rate, the transaction costs are very much lower. And rather than having to work between like any particular buyer, having to go through and find a particular seller, and then having to go through and sort all that out, now you can have a centralized exchange and go and say, well, okay, so SpaceX, Blue Origin, all of these people can all send these standardized containers. Who is selling what for cheapest? And so it becomes a whole lot more efficient in terms of a market there. And one of the major reasons why this is also very useful is because the futures market has price stability. So at the moment, if you go up to SpaceX, whatever, and you go through a negotiated price, well, the price is basically a coin flip, you know, like order of magnitude-ish, but it's not particularly well defined. And that's partly because what you get is slightly different every time, but that's also because that's the nature of enterprise sales. So the important part about futures is that they allow third parties onto the market, so the investment banks and all the rest, so they can develop mathematical models of the price evolution of these standardized contracts over time. And so what they can go through and do is they can go and say, well, hey, this person wants to buy a ticket to Mars now, and this company wants to sell a ticket to Mars at this later time, and then the investment bank can go and basically bridge that through time as though there was always someone willing to buy and there was always someone willing to sell. And so rather than having to wait months or what have you to find someone to deal with, you can now do that in milliseconds. The second part is a short market, which, so in general, a short market allows you to sell a product that you don't have, which is a bit strange and can lead to some interesting side effects, as seen in the global financial crisis. But it's also very useful, if regulated properly, it is very useful in terms of allowing the price to more effectively lock onto the real value. You can also use these futures to create options. So, for example, let's say that you are looking to charter a starship to go to Mars. You can go through and get a call option on the rocket fuel that you're needing to buy. So let's assume there's a futures market for rocket fuel in the future. So you go through and say, I want to buy enough rocket fuel at Leo to get me into TMI, for example. I can go and say, well, I would like to make sure that I won't pay more than this amount of money for that. Whereas on the producer side, they want to make sure that they're going to make at least some floor amount of money to make sure that it's worth their while actually going through and mining and creating the fuel and shipping it over to Leo. The primary-secondary market is also very interesting, although that might have to go into the Q&A. And the bid-ask spread is mostly a measure of how well the market is tracking the true value of the futures contract. So if you have so the bid-ask spread is basically the difference between how much people are willing to buy it for, how much people are willing to sell it for. And so you'll find that when that becomes very small, that the true value of the future is well known, and then as it becomes larger and larger, the true value is not well known. And so this is an interesting point. And so everyone's gone through and said, oh, hey, reusable rockets are the future, and there are very obvious reasons why they are. Mostly in that if you had a 747 that crashed in the ocean every time you went and used it, plane travel would be very expensive. But that being said, container ships and airliners are all made using finance leases and mortgages. And so that then means that when you're needing to build a new airplane, build a new starship, you don't go and grab the however many $1 million and try and raise that off investors. You go to a bank. And it turns out the banks are really good at lending money for these sorts of things. But it does have an issue in terms of overproduction stability. So this is in the container shipping market. As there was a shift over from basically owners owning their own boats into much larger boats that required these mortgages, one of the internal cycles that used to stabilize the price of shipping was removed. And that sort of stabilizer was that when the price of freight dropped enough, all the people who owned the boats kind of took the boats and went on holiday and just refused to ship. And so the price would come back up as the supply dropped. However, when you had these mortgages, now people couldn't do that anymore. And so you ended up with a whole bunch of shipping companies going bankrupt. So that's just a point to keep in mind. Second part is loans for immigration. So moving to America model, not a very good name for it, but if you are, for example, out of rural Nepal and what have you, and you're looking to come to America to go through and get a better life, there are two standard ways you go and do that. The first is that you and your family come together to pool a set of money aside to go through and buy the ticket to send you over. The second is that you go through and take out a loan, which you then go and use to pay for the ticket and all the rest. And so that is one model through. And the second is you can have the government go and underwrite this. You can have both the government underwrite the loan, sort of student loan style, and the second is you can also have a government agency go and hand out the loans with a set of caveats attached such that in general, as the people move over to Mars, they're going to be productive enough on Mars for it to be worthwhile in terms of the increase in tax take. Because keep in mind that as you're moving these people, who you're assuming they've gone through some vetting, so they're likely to be highly productive citizens, well, they're somewhat of a captive market once they get to Mars, because they need to go through and earn enough to eat, and so they have to earn enough to be taxed. So this is just an interesting aside. So breakbulk versus containerization is something that should change, and it's going to be interesting to see when that changes. So breakbulk shipping was back before we had container ships. You just take a whole bunch of like little boxes of stuff and bags of stuff and just shove it into the ship's hold willy-nilly. And that's really good in terms of packing efficiency, but that's really bad in terms of port efficiency, and loading and unloading takes a lot longer, and has a whole bunch of problems on that sort of thing. Whereas containers, specifically shipping containers, are much cheaper to load and offload. They're much more efficient to load and offload. And so it's going to be interesting once sending things to space becomes cheap enough that it then becomes worthwhile to containerize it. But the rest of the slide is mostly pointing out that there is a thing called the Universal Postal Union, which runs under the UN. And so they deal with the fact that you can have addresses, and addresses go to places, and they have an amount charged for shipping. And there's an international convention that allows you to go through and charge certain amounts for shipping. So if, for example, the USA was to go and declare a new territory on Mars, it could go back to the UN and say, oh, by the way, we have this new territory here, and by the way, the postal shipping rates are this many $1,000s a kilogram, this many whatever it is. At which point, you could then go on to eBay or what have you and go and buy your widgets and just ask them to get posted to Mars. And they would. And I think that's really cool. Don't know about you. So I was talking about financial engineering. This is a quick rundown because I think I'm running out of time. So the way most financial products work is as various forms of trusts. So what is a trust? How does all this work? So a trust, like the trust itself, is kind of a logical unit that separates things out. The trust deed is a program that is written in legalese. So you know how normally computer programs are written in computer languages? This is a program. It's written in legal code. Its inputs are assets and cash flows, and its outputs are assets and cash flows. And this runs on, let me just get some air quotes, the cloud, which is an orphan SPV structure. So it's an SPV, which is a single-purpose vehicle. So it's a company that exists solely to run these sorts of things. It's not a company that actually trades. It's an orphan because it exists separate from the people who are actually doing the trading. So it's being run by a third party, hence the air quotes for on the cloud. And it's regulated through the trust deed, which is the program. The things that it's operating on are the trust assets. The trustee is the orphan SPV, so it's the company. But it has a special legal, like it sits within a special legal framework that says you can manage these assets, but you can't use them to enrich yourself. So 30-second overview of that. So this is, So the major reason why you want government-backed reinsurance is because the major thing that's preventing you from issuing loans for these mortgages and all the rest is because they involve a whole lot of risks that aren't well understood. And because they aren't well understood on the commercial side, it's very risky to go through and say, well, hey, I'm going to take on that risk, and I'm going to go and say that I'm going to go and be fully responsible for that. And so what you'll find is that most of the commercial companies will simply refuse to do business, or will do so at very expensive terms that make it basically unusable. So by having government-backed reinsurance, the government is taking the final fall for things that operate very far outside of some well-defined bounds, at which point then the insurance companies can issue all of their standard products, and banks and all the rest can then start issuing their loans and mortgages as they normally would. Just quickly, so REITs are an investment vehicle that let you collectively buy land. So on Mars, going through and having a single-person house doesn't really make much sense, mostly because you need life support and all the rest. It's better to do that in bulk. So the idea behind this is that you go and have your land rights and all the rest owned by your trustee, which is basically running the REIT. Then you have a set of investor classes, which are different types of units. So from a few slides earlier on, I defined the term units, which are basically categories of those outputs. So the idea is you have, for example, an investor class A, so they could, for example, be only investing in the value of the land on Mars going up, whereas these apartment owners, they could be investing in the rights to live in the apartments, but not the land that they're living on. And so you can go through and have a whole bunch of different unit holders for this. But the important point for this is that it makes it a whole lot more palatable for people on Earth to buy these units as an investment or what have you, even though the people who are mainly going to be benefiting from this are going to be on Mars. So this is, so who here has heard of like an index fund? Yeah? Okay. Kind of a similar sort of a thing. An ETF is a more general form. So an ETF is an exchange-traded fund. The idea is that it's a company. It's another one of those SPV companies. So it doesn't trade in and of itself. What it does do is it holds, for example, those Mars REIT units that I mentioned earlier on. It can hold Martian debt. It can hold all kinds of things depending on what it's defined to do. Like these things generally have a statement as to what they're holding. But then because they're a public company, they can issue shares. And so those shares are publicly traded. And so rather than, for example, trying to buy into a Mars REIT, which could require $50 or $100 or $200,000 to go and buy one of those units, or trying to get into the investment, for example, the venture capital scene, where trying to get into that then requires you're an accredited that you are an accredited investor with a very high net worth and this and that and the other. Now, pretty much anyone on the face of the planet can buy a couple of these shares because they're generally only, say, $10, $20 each. And because they're publicly traded, that then makes them a nice sort of addition to a 401k, a pension fund, or what have you. And then as kind of a final point, because I think we're running out of time, so this is a way of terraforming Mars through free markets. Well, a very interesting form of free markets, because it's half free market, half government intervention. So the idea is that, so at the moment on Earth, the UN has a whole bunch of treaties, one of which includes all of the greenhouse gases and how effective they are at causing global warming. So the idea is you go up to all these factory owners on Mars, because at the end of the day, Mars is going to need a whole bunch of factories to produce things. And you go and you say, well, hey, you're producing these emissions. Well, let me convert these into this unit, these units for you, based on how effective those are at creating global warming. And so on the other side, you have to try and create a market for these units. You need them to be worth some amount of money. But once you do this, now all these factory owners have a financial incentive to make sure that they are as polluting as possible. Yeah, and so the way I was thinking of doing this is you either have a requirement where to get certain permits or whatever, you need a certain number of units, or have a certain number of units per unit output, or you have a conversion between those units and government bonds. Because at the end of the day, if you're a country, you can go through and issue, for example, 100-year government bonds, because you're a country. And so you can go and pay for these units using the benefit that you would get for example, 100 years worth of warming. And now it is also, I'm not sure about this, yeah. So it is an interesting point to keep in mind that Mars has a very uneven surface, and so the conditions required to go through and terraform the entirety of Mars through the addition of greenhouse gas or whatever, like that takes an incredible amount of warming. However, there are certain places on Mars, so specifically in the deep trenches, where the atmospheric pressure is getting to just about the nice sort of spot where you can start to have liquid water, and it would be maybe a nice spot for a colony. So you can go through and see how even if a market like this would not be effective at trying to terraform an entire planet, it could be effective in getting these limited regions from just outside a habitable zone, or a stable habitable zone, into a stable habitable zone. And so I'd just like to thank the Mars Society for giving me the opportunity to come and present here. I'd like to thank BlueSat, UNSW. So UNSW is a university in Australia, where I'm from.
Wales.
Oh, what's that, sir?
University of South Wales.
New South Wales.
New South Wales.
Yes, New South Wales.
What happened to Old South Wales?
That's still in Wales. So BlueSat is a microsatellite project. It's run by the students there. They're very inclusive at bringing newcomers. So specifically from me, because I had an electronics background, and they went through and they said, oh, hey, you like electronics, come do aerospace stuff with BlueSat, and I learned an awful lot and caught the space bug through them. And I'd also like to thank Martin Jenkins, who is a friend of mine who helped me with the presentation. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned futures contracts for shipping containers to Mars.
Yeah.
Is that are there futures contracts for that on Earth? I mean, is there precedent for that actually operates on Earth?
So the shipping industry on Earth is kind of convoluted. So the futures contracts for things like fuel and all the rest, those do 100% exist exactly as you're expecting them to. The futures contracts for shipping containers to Mars, they don't exist in this way, but there's no reason why they should be. So, for example, there are certain metals at the moment that aren't traded on a futures exchange, on a standard commodities exchange, not for any particularly good reason, but that's just the way they've been traded. So, yeah. Yeah.
So the sun is getting warmer.
Yep.
In billions of years, it'll be pretty nice over there, and the crust will be melted over here on Earth.
Yes.
So it looks like it might be a good place for for real estate investments, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so the question is, so I'm a crazy long-term investor. I want to buy land in Mars. How do you do that nowadays?
And, well, that then comes back to, yeah.
Jure?
So, first off, you need to go and acquire Mars, or at least some portion of it. And that then comes back to the original point, where we need to make it commercially viable to go through and to start these sorts of investments, at which point all the legislative and political sort of issues will start to wash away, and we will end up in a situation where, yes, you can go through and buy land on Mars easily.
In other words, lawmakers won't act until there's a reason to act.
Yeah, and until there is profit. Because at the end of the day, the easiest way to get lobbyists on your side is to make it profitable. Yeah.
I was wondering about that same profitable. What is your return on investment idea? Like, is there a 1-to-1 ratio? Do you have a 1-to-7 to make this possible, I guess? Or
And this is... yeah. So, tranches, which I skipped over due to lack of time.
sorry.
So, that's all good. The idea behind tranches is that they're kind of like units, except that you're numbering your dollars as they go out. So the idea is that, so a standard bond or a loan is, I owe you $10 in 10 days. So the way you tranche this is you go through and say, oh, hey, I've got this business venture, it'll generate some amount of money. I will take the first $10 and give it to whoever owns this. Then I'll take the next $10 and give it to whoever owns this, and the next $10. And so the idea behind this is that on Mars, you can go through and tranche this out so that the initial set of tranches is going to be reasonably low risk, but also low reward. Whereas the higher tranches are going to be considerably more, more risky, but have considerably more reward. And that's kind of the way you do that. There's also another term here called a liquidation preference, but that's a bit more complicated.
So I guess a follow-up would be each unit that you've talked about would have a different ROI.
Yeah, well, they're generally different classes of units. So it's like Class A, Class B.
Okay, thanks.
Let's take the example from Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
Oh, yeah,
The Chinese come and they attack and completely destroy the U.S. base.
Yep.
So as a result, we have an immense economic loss plus the loss of life.
Yep.
The International Court of Criminal Justice is completely toothless, can't arrest anybody for eating a ham sandwich.
Yeah.
There's no justice available in any court for that action.
Yeah.
How do you explain having all of these other elaborate economic structures when there is no fundamental right to life or property in space?
And that then comes back down to this. Because at the end of the day, if you have a de jure, if you have proper legal rights to these, to the new Mars base and all the rest, then that new Mars base, if it was attacked, is the same as if someone was to attack Hawaii. And so, at the end of the day, as long as the US in particular recognizes that it's the same as Hawaii, then that would essentially change the response there.
So that means the United States has to go to war with China over a base that only has 15 or 20 people in it.
It has to decide whether it wants to.
Yeah, and so this is where you end up in a Falkland Islands sort of situation.
Result is,
Yeah.
nobody has anything,
Yeah, sorry?
so.
I have a sort of question that I don't mean this to sound unpleasant.
Yeah.
Complex financial engineering has gained a reputation among some of us of being rather dangerous.
Yeah.
Don't you think that maybe simpler structures would be a good idea? That sometimes the problem is people don't understand them and they don't really understand how they're valued or why they're being valued in the way they are being valued.
On one hand, I definitely see where you're coming from in terms of the notoriety that's been gained. Sometimes that's somewhat questionable in terms of high-frequency trading and all the like. Keep in mind that this sort of financial engineering isn't the sort of super complex financial engineering you would see with like CMOs, CDOs, and all the rest. This is more of the standard financial engineering that is the basis of, for example, all farm production on Earth. So this is kind of the cornerstone of the modern economy, sort of thing. Yeah. But definitely a good point, especially for things like tranches. So if you were to, for example, take all these mortgages for the starships and sell them off as CMOs, that's when you start getting into the questionable territory. But that then also comes down to properly regulating it as you would any other sort of product. Yeah.
I have a hunch that for the foreseeable future, Mars is going to be pretty much like the South Pole. And you know, geologists, hopefully biologists, and then there'll be people supporting them commercially to living, and then basically these people are going to get bored, so they're going to say, I want to have families here, so we need to have schools here and stuff like that, but it's going to be little settlements growing. Does the South Pole in any way match up with your analysis here? What's happening there?
So this is interesting. So in some ways, the South Pole is similar-ish to Mars in that there is currently an international agreement that it's used for scientific purposes. That being said, that agreement is A, a whole lot stricter, and B, a whole lot more well-defined, I would put it that way. Simply because you have more people there, and there's very much a status quo. The other side to this is that the South Pole isn't especially, like, aside from minerals and all the rest that are currently not too useful but may be useful in the future, the South Pole doesn't really get you much that you wouldn't get in, say, Iowa. Whereas if you're on Mars and you're looking to grow out into the asteroid belt and you're looking to get that level of resources, or if you're looking to go through and produce things that require tremendous amounts of power. So for example, Mars is a very good place to shove ridiculously sized nuclear reactors because, again, the place is already desolate, but it still has the required minerals to go and get you your uranium and what have you. So if you're looking at things that require incredible amounts of power and what have you, that then makes a lot of sense to do that from Mars, whereas the South Pole is simply a less convenient place on Earth.
I tend to view it the other way around. I think that there's a lot more potential for commercial activity on the South Pole because if you find minerals there, you can sell them.
Oh, definitely.
Whereas if you find anything on Mars, it's pretty much for local use only.
For local use only, and again for expanding out to the asteroid belt.
And there, of course, we know that's a booming market out there.
Well, one of these days.
Witness planetary resources.
Yeah. Well, I do fully get where you're coming from, and especially in terms of the South Pole and the North Pole, and their resources and the like. And at the end of the day, this is a fundamentally a very hard question, because saying why isn't it so kind of presupposes that there's already a reason. Yeah, sorry.
Regarding the comparison with the South Pole, I think it's important to realize that the reason the South
sorry,
Pole...
guys, could you quieten down? Yes, sir.
The reason the South Pole is not well developed is because of the Antarctic Treaty. If you look at similar environments on Earth that are not covered by that treaty, like Svalbard or the Falkland Islands, they are in fact inhabited. It is the fact of the treaty regime that means that's the reason there's nothing but scientific basis there.
Yeah, and you have the similar sorts of things with Greenland. Yeah, it is.
Well, plus also though, it's incredibly expensive to live there. It's god awful cold nothingness. You want to go see a movie? Well, it's streaming off a satellite. That's it. You want to?
Well, but my point is every place that it's not illegal like that, people can live there. Greenland, Svalbard, Iceland.
We haven't built cities under the sea. It's not illegal.
That's,
No, it's just inconvenient, and that's where a lot of this comes from. In terms of there are things that you can do conveniently on Mars that you can't conveniently do on Earth, but there aren't many things you can conveniently do on the South Pole that you can't conveniently do in Iowa.
I think 250 years from now,
Yeah.
a lot of the stuff you have up here will actually apply, and it'll actually be developed. But I think initially it's going to be South Pole territory, and maybe we just need to basically make the restrictions less restrictive or something like that to allow it to grow.
And that's a very sort of, in some ways it is a similar discussion, I do see your point there. In some ways it's also a very separate sort of discussion, because given that it is already somewhat of a contested territory, it's going to come down a lot more to the interpolitics between all the different nations that already do things around there, or have the various claims and or contested claims into those waters. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that all turns out.
Yeah.
But I do definitely see where you're coming from, where especially as resources elsewhere start to be depleted, looking into the North Pole, looking into the South Pole, that does make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just comment that you're showing a very sound financial system that indeed could attract investments to Mars, and and at the point where you start getting small colonies and so forth. I think some people are sort of have been feeling that we'll just have utopian colonies that just kind of exist and somehow survive without an economy or
Yeah.
needing things from Earth. But you're giving a good real world perspective on this.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is also interesting to see, because there are plenty of colonies, specifically if you look through the history of America, that were founded because people had their sort of their picture of the colony that they wanted in their head, and they didn't fully understand all of the implications that came along with that, and so they could bring large groups of people over, and then because they then had to live there, you ended up with a full city or what have you.
Sure.
So that could definitely be part of the colonization here. Especially if you have a religious or other group that goes through and says, well, hey, let us go through and create a new land for ourselves over here. But yeah, all interesting. Any other questions, or is that all good? Thank you very much.